So, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure, like Thomas said, to come back in a way and present something which probably you didn't know I was interested in, which is post-publication peer review. This is a suggestion by Thomas, but I thought it was a real good topic, as we shall see, for DARIAH to learn more about. I'll explain everything about this, I hope. That was quite some preparation work, because this is a complex issue for many reasons, because it's not consensual and also because the vocabulary is not completely set. Half of the talk will be dedicated to some basic concepts and some kind of theory about post-publication peer review, but about scholarly publishing at large. And then I show a variety of existing platforms so that you get a good idea of what's going on in the private and public sectors as well. And we'll see how we can somehow generalize the issues related to post-publication peer review, PPPR. So first, why do we speak about this topic and why now? You're all aware that there's an ever-increasing concentration of services held by commercial publishers. Just look at the recent acquisition by Elsevier. Mendeley, Bpress, Scopus, SSRN are all now part of the Elsevier portfolio. There is a strong request by scholars at large for more transparency in the reviewing process. I guess all of us who have submitted papers or reviewed or being editors on journal conferences have learned to be worried about the peer review process. The interesting thing is that it comes together with a wider implementation of open science concepts. You've seen the recent Plan S evolution, for instance, which insists on preserving authors' copyright as one of their main assets. It has improved, for instance, Plan S as compared to what happened 2 years ago. And then, of course, it's the feasibility. You have technical platforms which allows you to experiment post-publication peer review, and we will see a few of them today. For DARIAH, I think it's really interesting because obviously peer review, as it came somehow from the hard sciences, does not apply so well to SSH in many respects. It's on one side because you don't have the same criteria of comparison between works in SSH, because SSH, in particular in the domain of digital humanities, is going towards all types of objects, so not just papers, but also blog post, education material. We see that with DARIAH Campus. And it's important to analyze that as a community and see how we can reintroduce the notion of scholarly debate about a specific work in the context of post-publication peer review. So let us start with the beginning. Scholarly publication. So it has been for nearly 300 years the main communication channel of science. But it has become also the main assessment tool, which is one of the difficulty when we speak about publish and perish and journal citation indexes. Publications are not just the pleasure of communicating to others, it's also a way to make sure that you've got a line on your CV. And it dates back to the Republic of Letters, which some of us are interested in. So the first journals that are known are, on the one hand, in France, the Journal des Savants, and in the UK, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, both of which have introduced some kind of mechanisms to select what they would receive per post, so some kind of peer review. And this was the genesis of the notion of scientific community as a whole, because they had to group together contributions by topics, for instance, to be able to disseminate that. In this context, peer review, although I said they introduced a long time ago, the notion of peer review has not occurred for a long time in the context of scholarly publication. For a long time, existing journals were just managed by an editor who would just screen the papers and put them, if he thought it would be valuable, with not really asking friends, not always, as at least. It's just after World War II where the scholarly publishing landscape has become a real business, and because of the limitation of paper, you could not print out so many papers that you had to select. Even the good ones had to be selected, and that the notion of peer review went in. This has been accompanied by a real standardization of the corresponding format. If you look at, here you've got some excerpt from the Zeitschrift für Naturforschung. That was the first scientific journal allowed to be published in Germany after World War II. So something, I mean, Max Planck was behind the push to have this journal put in place. You see to the right a single paper, a very short one. So you don't have any bibliography, you don't have any state of the art, you don't have anything. You just have a result, and which is good. I mean, this is what we do in blog posts, for instance. Or you could have in memoriam. So this very nice in memoriam about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz here. And you see by just looking at the papers in the Zeitschrift für Naturforschung, where decade after decade, the format has been de-standardized as we know it now, and has been imposed somehow to the social sciences as well. The last point here of analysis is the publication in the digital world. The switch from paper to digital publishing has obviously changed a lot. So the limitation of space has disappeared, but also it has introduced a very flexible publication time. You're not obliged to wait until you've got 5 papers to print out an issue. You can just put the papers one by one. And this has led to some kind of impatience by authors saying, okay, I'll send my paper, once accepted, should be online immediately. No, it's more complex than that, because there are a lot of legacy processes existing, among which peer review there. Finally, and this is one of the things, we'll come back to that in the next slide, but to introduce the topic is the ubiquity of the notion of published objects. So because of the digital nature of papers now, you can have it everywhere. You can have it on your website, you can have it on the publisher's website, you can put it on, no, you can't, but you could put it on ResearchGate if you're really unaware of what's going on in the publishing environment. And basically it could go all over the place and in multiple formats, versions with different metadata and so on. So now going deeper into scholarly journal, I like to cite, I was about to say Darth Vader, Michael Mabe, the former director of the STM Association, who wrote a very nice paper analyzing the components of a scholarly journal. So the components being registration, dissemination, peer review, archival record, and you see to the right the kind of consequence from the point of view of the scholar. It can be used, a scholarly paper, to claim priority. By disseminating, you receive feedback, you're getting fame. The peer review is supposed to canvas content to fit into the expected model, the kind of standardization I've mentioned. And finally, the archival record, that's something which has been held up, and I mean what I say, by publishers for a long time, because it's supposed to be the role of the publisher to keep this archival record of the publication, alleviating the author from even the idea that he could keep his own corpus of publications, especially in the digital domain. And basically, the current scholarly journal landscape is being locked by this whole process as one single workflow. You cannot take one of those pieces and take this out. There is, so, quite a few issues concerning the current scholarly system. I want to point to some of them related to post-publication peer review. The first thing is really the ambiguity of the term publication. On the one hand, you could think, well, publication is to make something public. So I'm showing you a piece of paper and you're automatically accepting that it is being made public. Whereas when we speak about publication, oh, what's your latest publication, Thomas? We think about the official one, the one which has been peer reviewed in the journal, DHQ, what have you. So this ambiguity is a real problem when we speak about past publication peer review, because it's already locked that we cannot speak of a publication by just something being made public. And this is the direction in which we need to go. Like I mentioned, there is a variety of potential peer-reviewed objects or not peer-reviewed. So we need to know in the future what will count as a publication. So as an object which we're proud of and which has been disseminated. And of course, behind the scene, why the whole thing is locked and why this ambiguity exists is because there is a business behind. It has to do with price. It has to do with copyright, owning the copyright of an object at the end of the day. And as we know, I'm just making a small parenthesis on this, the notion of open access publishing has not made the thing better. If you consider, let's take the example of frontiers, for instance, the business model behind that has encouraged even the publisher itself to publish more, to earn more money, with some pressure on editorial boards. You've heard the stories to put in more papers, even those who would have been normally rejected. There are some general issues related to peer review. I'm kind of accelerating on this, not to be too detailed, but you'll have the slides afterwards. The aspects of, I mean, the main issue is about transparency, because we can see that peer review can be slow, can be very subjective, depending on who the reviewer are. You've got difficulties to find reviewers. Look at the final citation at the end of the slide from an editor saying, well, it can be nice to have peer review, but most of the time it is a frustration to find reviewers, to look at the reviews which are incomplete, made too quickly, or too nasty sometimes. So, and the notion of peer review together with journals leads to a lot of conservatism. Again, the system being locked, the reviewers review according to what they think the journal should look like, and not necessarily because they're a brand new idea that you would like to push forward. So how do we escape what I've read somewhere as being the increasing journal desperation? And one of the entry point is this quote from Villa 2019, considering that some journals are practicing desk rejection. It's not in the usual topic of a journal, whether they should not consider immediate acceptance as well. Oh, nice paper, let's publish it, just to see whether the community would accept it. But that's going in the direction of post-publication peer review. Let us first publish and see afterwards whether it goes in the right direction. Back to basics. Behind the scene, we're all aware of these concepts related to open science. I'm not going to elaborate, but I want to mention this paper by Tennant and al. 2019, because it contains a very nice diagram, this one, where they identify this necessary decoupling mechanism. On the top, you've got the traditional peer review publishing workflow, manuscript submitted to a journal with an editor, peer reviewers, and only at the end of the day, you've got the community being there. In this paper, the authors suggest that if you could have a parallel path through which the paper would be disseminated, that's the notion of preprint at a very early stage, you would have a better dissemination process. At least the dissemination block in the 4 components of Mabe's diagram could be taken out and be used independently of the journal itself. So how does it work in the context of post-publication peer review? By definition, post-publication peer review is about providing an assessment mechanism after a scholarly document has been published, in the sense of made publicly available. And there are 2 basic building blocks. On the one hand, a publication repository, the host for the object, and a so-called overlay service, which is a certification platform that will allow reviewers to carry out their assessment. Still, again, there are issues related to vocabulary. The first one is that people have considered post-publication peer review for unpeer-reviewed material, so brand new things that you put like a preprint, but also for already renewed material. So post-publication peer review as the first assessment process. You've got a manuscript and in a repository, for instance, and then you comment or you decide about it, or you've got an already published paper that then goes to a commenting platforms. And you need to be aware of the difference, because if you read citations like the last one on the slide, you need to know that Knöpfler here things about the second case. That is something which has already peer-reviewed and published, but then a platform where you select the best papers to create what it says the scientific collective, what would be brought into the scientific collective. So it's important to keep this in mind. The second aspect is the level of formality. Post-publication peer review may cover all types of formalism in the sense of you could invite reviewers officially on the one hand, but on the other hand, you can just leave a blog open for comments and have anyone commented with all types of intermediate levels like volunteer reviewers. This is what you have, for instance, in Science Open or the Winover platforms. I'm going quickly through this because I want to keep enough time on the one hand for the platforms, but also for the discussion afterwards. I keep this one? No. So is post-publication peer review from this point of view disruptive, as one would say in novelong, in modern speech? First, it's very important to consider that anyone who has started, I've experienced that, to think about post-publication peer review necessarily start thinking outside the common scheme of scholarly publishing. You start splitting the schema, Michael Mabe's schema, into pieces. And beyond open access, it's not just about open access. Of course, post-publication peer review allows you to think, okay, the object is made public immediately, so it's open access, but it's about the whole scholarly assessment system that you've got in mind. It's very important to see that post-publication peer review is important then in terms of services. If you've got a better identification of the various services involved in publishing something and selecting something, then you can identify the workflows between them. You can specify interfaces, even from a technical point of view. And of course, it impacts on business models. If you've got a host platforms and an overlay platform, you can assess the cost for hosting a paper, like how much it costs for archive to host one paper, and the cost of having and maintaining a journal on an overlay platform. So this is also going in a good direction. Of course, as we shall see, this is theoretical sometimes because those platforms pushing post-publication peer review put the two backs together like F1000, as we shall see, and make, again, I mean, a business model out of the whole thing. Besides, it may not be so disruptive. I mean, we've known post-publication peer review for years in our domains. For instance, when presenting a paper at the DH conference and afterwards having a full written version of the paper in the journal, I mean, you've been evaluated by your peers in the room, and then you get feedback which you put into the paper. Comments on the colleague, I'd like to quote this paper that Thomas knows, which is already in HAL in its version 4. It went around in 3 versions. I think, Thomas, you reviewed one of them before it was actually submitted to a journal. So I organized my own post-publication peer review before it existed in a way. You had the traditional notion of letters to the editor. You've got the notion of recension in SSH about a book. That says you publish the book and then you review the book afterwards. So it does exist. And the usual comments on blog posts that have always existed. There are challenges associated to the notion. The first one is ensuring participation. Okay, you bring in online and they will come. It's not the case. So some platforms have suffered, especially when the peer review was not channeled in the sense I presented before, of not being really used. Now, I'll show an example of a missed opportunity in a way. It's difficult also to control the reviewer's expertise. If, again, it's related to channeling, but if someone you don't know is commenting, even if there are some credentials associated to him, you may have problems of quality of feedback. Maybe not worse than what happened with classical peer review, because since most of those platforms are public, I mean, you put your name as a reviewer. We'll see a counter example, but if you put your name, then you put also your reputation at stake. there is a real risk of fragmenting the discussions. So one reviewer may take a little issue if it is an open peer review platform, and another will take another one, and then you've got threads of discussions that are difficult to combine. And finally, as we've seen with PubPeer, come back to that, there is this so-called gotcha mentality. So look at the papers not to take the best, but to find those who have had some misled scientific conduct, for instance. So there is a tension, like I put at the end, between encouraging online junk, you put anything online and we'll see how we manage, or really fostering responsibility. I'm proud of this paper, I put it online, and I ask colleagues to comment on it. So how does it work? Let's look at a few platforms. I like these slides, which I've stolen because I cannot find anything in it. So I'm showing it. It's complete, but it's not, I mean, the classification is not good per se. So I'll get back to my own characterization to show a few platforms. First, platforms doing post-publication peer review on already peer-reviewed objects. So you've got a paper published in a journal, and you've got a space to comment. The most famous platform is PubPeer. It has been conceived by a biologist with the objective, I quote, to develop critical thinking. And right from the beginning, the whole thing was really untransparent. For a long time, we didn't know who was behind. So they've never given their names until the time where they were obliged to. I'll come back to that. The workflow is clear. From a DOI or an entry in archive or PubMed Central, you can refer to the paper in PubPeer as a commenter and basically say anything you want. The issue is that commenters remain anonymous. It was not thought like this initially, but there were some requests, which could be understood by young researchers in particular, that they would not want to give their name. But this has led immediately to the shift to the gotcha mentality I was mentioning, that immediately some people went to the platform to catch the wrong behaviors of colleagues undercover because it was anonymous. So this has led, for instance, to this case, this lawsuit, where an author claims that he has lost a job because of a bad review on PubPeer and went to launch a trial accordingly. So there is a real problem there that one has to think about. On the contrary, if you think about PubMed Commons, so PubMed Central trying to put together a similar platform, but where contributors will not be anonymous. So they had to give their name. The consequence is the little red line you see there, which is that the platform never took up. So people prefer to go to PubPeer and be anonymous in commenting papers rather than using an official platform where they would put comments on other papers. It just wasn't really useful, let alone essential. So more like an experiment. So let's get back to the things we know. So post-publication peer review of author's manuscript that is unpublished material, and already peer-reviewed material. I'm going back to Mabes, so the dark side of publishing diagram. And when you look at it, and imagine you had a publication repository, most of the things you have there can be carried out by publication repositories. So you can put a paper of a repository and have it registered. So that's there. It disseminates by essence. And if the repository is a trusted one with good property of long-term archiving and so on, it can be a place for the archival record. So the essential place for the paper. The only thing you need to take care of is the peer review. Hence this, for me, very clear notion of post-publication peer review in the context of this diagram. Let me mention, for instance, my usual mention for obvious reasons, is that when you've got a paper, a preprint on publication repository, it's already considered official by instances. So the European Patent Office, for instance, is taking the presence of a paper online as a proof of anteriority for a given discovery, for instance. They don't care about peer review. If what is written in the paper online is anterior to what is submitted as a patent, the patent is off. So the baseline is, of course, to have a publication repository. I quote here all the very nice property, but which are essential from a publication point of view that such a repository must have. You need user identification, type stamping. You need to have stable identifiers, stable URIs to be able to refer to the object. Licensing information is very important for reuse purposes. And one thing which is very important is versioning. A repository which does not have versioning cannot be a basis for post-publication peer review, because you will update the paper. I mentioned an example of mine. You'll update the paper according to the feedback you receive. And at some point, e-version will be the official published one in the sense of being peer reviewed. And long-term archiving to have the version of records. This is very important from the point of view of the scholar. So this is where we could have a debate within DARIAH, for instance. That is the notion of author sovereignty. I decide where I put my digital material to have this homogeneous corpus of objects, and then peer review is just an add-on. It's not the publisher taking the object from me and deciding where it should be archived, how it should be disseminated, with which license, and so on. So this is really an essential aspect. There are quite a few discussion points about a publication repository, because first, they are ubiquitous. People would only put published in the old sense material, and others dare to put preprints. We should probably see how we disseminate the idea within the SSH domain of having more preprint aspect. It's very important to think that publication repositories are not free. They have a cost, so you need to know who is paying for what. I give some figures here. So the evaluation for archive, for instance, is $7 per article. It's not a lot, but after a while it sums up. You need to know what's going on. And the other aspect is the editorial policy of the repositories. We've had this debate with RGVET several times between Zenodo and HAL, for instance. HAL, you need to wait 1 or 2 days before your paper is actually online, because there are some people checking that you've not put a shopping list there, that the metadata correspond to what is in the paper, that there are some basic, that you've not put a publisher's PDF. If you go to Zenodo, you don't have that. You don't have any editorial check, which means that at the end of the day, you could have a bin of content at the place. And then the dark side, of course, publication repositories comes also with issues from the private sector. When you see King's College, the University of Amsterdam using Pure, yes, it's Elsevier. When you see, oh, poor, it's a former colleague of ours in the DH domain. I'm not mentioning his name because it's recorded, but just follow the link. Apologizing for using Figshare as the TU Delft repository. Okay, there are always good reasons that you're giving away again. So you think you're doing well with offering a publication repository to your scholars, but you're giving it away to the private sector again. So a very nice link also to follow is the JISC, because basically they're just selecting the platforms that people could buy or adhere to, which are all private, basically. You see the list. So an example of a monolithic commercial platform of publication peer review is F1000, which in between has become Taylor and Francis. And for those who have heard about this, they are the winners of this open research publishing platform. And what they came with is a single infrastructure that is both the left-hand side, article submission, the right-hand side, the peer review is part of a single platform. But in the middle, when you put a paper on the F1000 platform, it's like putting it into a preprint repository. After a quick check, it's available online. So it's already published. And then afterwards, you've got some mechanism of open peer review and user commenting with a combination that is, from the point of view of F1000 research, they either ask some reference reviewers, mainly in the biological domain, and people can also comment online. And they try to have some kind of editorial control. From this point of view, I must say they're doing a very good job, except that they were surprised. For instance, they tried to knock at the door in France, offering the platform like a reference, like a tool for post-publication peer review. Said, yeah, but you need to cut the left-hand side because in France we use HAL. We've got a publication repository, and they were surprised initially when I discussed with the colleagues there. I mean, there are quite a few clever colleagues, of course, in F1000, and they were surprised that there are places where you need to anchor on the platform. It has to do with sovereignty, like I mentioned. Second type of example in this thread is post-publication peer review as transitioning from traditional publication settings. One of the things that some scholars in charge of journal thought, or when we put together the Episciences platform, was to say, okay, if we want to attract people to this idea of post-publication peer review, it has to be in continuity with what they expect from a journal. So the initial experiment has been done by, I mean, the best one, the Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics journal. It's hosted by Copernicus, whom we know as an open publisher, but since many, many years. And it has been systematically coupled with a discussion forum, the so-called Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics discussions, with a very clear licensing policy. And again, after a quick screening by the editor, the preprint is posted, and then you've got an interactive publication discussion combining posting of referees, selected referees by the editor, and open comment by non-anonymous comment by the community. It has really been very efficient, probably because it's a very narrow topic and that the experts knew each other. So it was not a surprise to appear there. And there was a kind of, I would say, virtuous circle whereby older scholars would ask younger scholars to contribute just to gain fame, that they would know, they would have something to say about the paper. So it has become a tool for the corresponding community. In the same way, when we, so I say we now, decided to put together the Episciences platform as a post-publication platform, so nearly 10 years ago now, we imagine exactly this mechanism. We've got HAL, that was our thought, or archive, and we take everything we can from this publication repository platform, and on top of that, we provide a journal mechanism, which means that it's very innovative from the principle of post-publication peer review. Everything is coming, so metadata, versioning, and so on is coming from the repository platforms. But when you consider the peer review process as an overlay environment, when you go there as a reviewer or editor, it's very traditional. You select reviewers, you allocate them to a paper, you exchange, you can accept with modification and so on. You've got everything. You can have special issues hosted like on GDMDH, for those who know this journal. It's all very traditional on top of an innovative principle so that we could attract journals because we've got new ones, but at the same time, journals who are running out as of year, Springer and so on, going to the platform because they know they will find exactly what they had in the previous environments. So this is the process. You just put any kind of preprint. I mean, you put all your preprints because you should do that in a repository. And then you take one of the preprints and you push it to a journal by its identifier. And then the normal process of reviewing, and then the editor says, yes, you're accepted to the journal. So the preprint gets a stamp, a new version gets the metadata saying it's been published in the journal, blah, blah, blah. So that's quite traditional in a way. The lessons learned With Episciences, I could speak for hours about Episciences, so I've tried to reduce to 3 slides. You really have different feedbacks when you speak with a new journal who would like to join. There are really communities not accepting the notion of preprint. Let me say, for instance, in communities like the legal domain, so jurists have difficulties to imagine that a draft could be made public. They are very touchy on the final wording of the paper. Others are just frightened that all the good reasons that it could discuss in a discussion, that you put junk online, that that you will not be reliable. There is an issue of sustainability because you need to make sure that the publication repositories, like I said, have all the good properties. So you cannot just plug an overlay platform on any kind of repository. You need to know the editorial context. And also there is a technical issue. You need to link the repository with the overlay platform. And then a computer scientist would imagine that you need a protocol. Most of the platforms, Episciences like this, is using a very old protocol called OAI-PMH. So it takes a little bit of the metadata, an access point to the PDF, and then brings it into the platform. I put a few questions there. My favorite is the second one, is the notion of multiple branding, just to make you think. Imagine you've got a paper about sociology and agronomy. I mean, how do you develop new social communities in new ecological landscapes, for instance? You could imagine submitting your paper on the one hand to an agronomic journal, because you've got something to say to this community, but also to sociology journal. With fast publication peer review, it's obvious. You can have this single preprint and you can send it to 2 journals and have it published at 2 different places. Why not? Are we so conservative that we could not imagine that? We need to think about multiple, like there could be an ubiquity in the documents, there could be an ubiquity of the way the document is perceived, depending on where you've asked it to be branded. So, final example, I see the time is moving forward. Post-publication peer review as a recommendation process. I want to mention this peer community in project, which is really interesting. The idea was to create, on top of preprints from a variety of environment, a platform where you could collect peer reviews for your own sake. So either ask colleagues, or colleagues would spontaneously comment on the paper, and the reviews would be published. You could, I mean, the reviewers could ask to remain anonymous or not, so it's open from this point of view. And then once the paper has been reviewed by the platform, PCI, you can go to a journal with your reviews and say, look, I've got this paper, I received these reviews from this very eminent professor and this expert in the field, and I would like to be published. And it has worked because all the journals you see here have agreed to take into consideration the existing reviews for acceptance in the in their publication. So you've got a post-publication peer review with post-publication afterwards. I mean, there could be complex workflows that would be put together in this respect. Okay, to conclude, it would be, I mentioned the technical issue. I want to mention that people are thinking about it, how to connect, because once you've decoupled, you could imagine any type of publication repository, any time of reviewing platforms and connecting the two. There's a document which has just been issued in August following an initiative by CORE, the Consortium of Open Access Repository, as a follow-up to something maybe you've seen, the PubFair initiative. Got people like Tony Ross behind that and so on, which have designed some scenarios and started to put together protocols for having the two platforms speak to one another. So typically, there are issues like this. You've got the repositories sending a message to a journal saying, oh, I've got a paper and I would like it to be reviewed. It has been actuated by the user there. And then the platform sends back some information. So yeah, acknowledge, peer review has started. We've received the review. So there's a real communication channel between the two platforms. Should speak to you somehow. You've seen it, yeah. So. And then, for instance, when the journal has finished the review, it sends to the repository the necessary information and the metadata to be actuated on the corresponding object. So this is something which takes time. It's only a beginning, so we don't have even a protocol to be implemented. We just have use cases at present, but it's really going in the right direction. So, conclusion. I think we've got a lot of building blocks to go into a more open scholarly communication environment in the context of post-publication peer review, but not only. We've seen that we've got conceptual blocks. To my view, after really screening a lot of recent publication on the domain, the concepts are starting to be clear in my mind, I must say. And we've got some technical blocks which would allow people to experiment on that. I think we can really contribute to the evolution of peer review in general by going in this direction, to see where we want things to be open, the reviews themselves, the names of the reviewers, the association between reviews and papers. And there are some good lessons for DARIAH, probably. I think we need, as DARIAH, to understand what use we could do of those platforms, and how those features can be matched onto SSH needs somehow. We could recommend, as part of our DARIAH's open science policy, recommend more dissemination of preprint, but in general, early publication of results. And we could experiment. So my dream would be that DARIAH campus could be plugged onto Episciences and that we would have a peer review environment to stamp, to brand those content in DARIAH campus that would be that are scholarly important with whatever criteria. And I'm not even sure we need a cultural revolution for this, so that's all there. So thank you very much. We can switch, I guess. Just to mention, I've gathered a lot of references which are very small there. I put them in my private Zotero subfolder on the topic, and I could make that public depending on how we organize that with the DARIAH Zotero environment.